All right, it's gonna start in like a minute, but maybe I'll mute some stuff here in the background. Well, welcome back to the frameworkless.js course. This is episode 2. So last time around, we began building an app, and today we're gonna pick up where we left off. So let's kind of dig in. I hope that had an awesome few days. So it's been, I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks between the two videos. Yeah, I hope you had an awesome time so far, and I hope that you find this next little bit useful and educational. P.S. Sorry about the audio a little bit. There's a ceiling fan up above me, and it's blowing, it's rotating and blowing, and I can't really turn it off. It's also hot AF in here, so if I turn it off, I'm going to literally melt, or my computer will, more importantly. So unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with the speaker, or it blowing into the speaker. All right, so let's begin, I suppose. All right, so I'll start digging through the slides here. Last time we started building this Node.js app, as I was saying. We utilized the existing HTTP create server functionality that is built into Node, so we didn't use any modules for that. And we created a static file server with it. So all we did was serve CSS files, HTML files, and so forth, images from the public directory. So nothing too complicated, but just a great starting point because, well, if you're going to have a web page, chances are you will have some static files. So it's a good starting point. I just want to note a few things before we dig in. The first thing is we had a pull request right after I released the code base for the previous video, and Joshua Eliers graciously submitted a pull request that fixed a small vulnerability in the code. So if you're interested to read more about it, you can click the link in the notes or just go to the repository and go to the pull requests. I merged in already. He kind of explains very simply what the issue is. Essentially, you can load in files from a higher up directory, a parent directory, by utilizing the ... / syntax. Kind of an elementary problem, but I guess we never got around to fixing it last time, so it's great. Thanks a lot, Josh, for fixing that. The fix is actually rather simple. You can take a look at it. It's just essentially a regex, regular expression pattern, and if it passes, then we continue, otherwise we quit. And that's pretty much that. So thanks again, Joshua, on that. And the second thing I wanted to cover was a question that I got in one of my maker groups, so the maker log group. Somebody was asking, doesn't the frameworkless way create a lot of boilerplate code? Well, yes and no. So you're of course going to write boilerplate code. It's kind of natural that you're going to create a lot of the piping required that, for example, something like Express does for you in the background. But the thing with Express is you're still going to create some boilerplate no matter what framework you use, such as Express. So no matter what, you're going to write boilerplate. And I've written my fair share with frameworks and without. And the difference is that we are not using basically any frameworks to do this stuff for us. And so we can keep it simple. We can understand all the pieces that are involved. And we can reuse the code as we see fit or alter it as we see fit without having to be learning an API for a specific module out there somewhere. But if you have anything to add or if you want to continue the discussion, please take it away to the Frameworkless Telegram group. I would love to hear from you on this if you have sort of more thoughts on this. Whether or not the Frameworkless way works for you is a good question as well. But one thing that I wanted to do to sort of help alleviate this issue is I'm actually going to take some of the small self-contained modules that we build as a result of this course, and I'm going to publish them as NPM packages. And the difference is I'm not creating a framework for you, so I'm not just saying frameworkless is just another framework. It's not. What I'm doing is I'm creating a few helpers for you to build your own app in the frameworkless way. So what I'm going to do is, for instance, one of those things is going to be the static file responder. So that static file responder that we wrote so long ago, this one, serve static file, I will make a module out of this so that you don't have to maintain this code in particular. You can just import a module that just does this, but you can still write all of the other code involved in this. And yeah, so that'll just be an option for you to avoid some of the boilerplate bloat that my friend Akash has pointed out in the Makerlog group. All right, so moving along, one thing we didn't really cover last time, but was actually in the code base that I committed for the first class, was error handling. Now, error handling is a funny subject because it's one of the most difficult things to do right in an app, actually, because the polar extremes are to do everything ad hoc on one side, aka write a lot of sort of redundant, non-dry code all over the place. And the other sort of extreme is to over-engineer some kind of crazy, super advanced error handling solution. And we're going to try to find sort of a balance in between. And I find the best way to find that balance is to use the pre-built stuff that comes with Node already, and actually V8 in JavaScript in general, modern JavaScript. And those things are the error object and try and catch blocks. So if you're not familiar with this stuff, error object is just like in every other programming language. You have an error object of some kind. Every other programming language pretty much that I'm aware of has an error type, an error object perhaps, that you can use in order to essentially report an error into your application, and often it crashes your app. And the other thing is try-catch blocks. This is also a pretty common pattern. So what a try-catch block does is when you put something inside of a try, all of the steps that you place inside of it are attempted, as they would be in a normal function, say, for instance. The difference is that if any error happens at any moment, the execution of that code is immediately halted, and the error that is generated as a result of that problem, that whatever that happened, is then passed into the catch block. So then inside of the catch, you're guaranteed that any code that's inside of the catch block, you will execute because there's an error. So it's a pretty handy construct, actually. And especially, I want to really emphasize this. Promises and async code in Node.js will really benefit from try-catch blocks. The reason is because that is the preferred error handling method for both promises and async constructs, particularly async await. And the reason is that, for example, the promise is a catch method that you can pass a function into. It's almost the same thing. So that's essentially what you want to do. You want to be able to catch any object, any error object that is generated as you create the code. Otherwise, it is extremely difficult to debug asynchronous code if you don't do this. So yeah, anywhere that you think makes sense to use try-catch, use try-catch. The one thing I would like to say is don't overuse try-catch. If you find yourself writing try-catch in every single layer of every single function that is executed inside of the other, you are probably not doing what you want to do. You don't necessarily have to put a try-catch into everywhere you use asynchronous methods. It's just more that at some point in the stack of functions that you're running, you should have a try-catch. And usually there should be a try-catch in the sort of the overall parent method. And error handling is difficult to write. So what we're going to do next is a very simple way of doing it, a very simple way of handling it, and you can expand on this method quite a bit in your own apps, depending on what you need. So my goal here is to just show you how to do this really simply. Once that's done, yeah, Godspeed. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to create an errors object, and that errors object is essentially going to be a map or essentially a dictionary of what errors, what type of behavior errors should create. In this case, all we are worried about right now, because we're not actually displaying any error messages offhand, we just want to return the correct HTTP status code in case of an error. So for instance, we have several not founds built into our app already because of static files. And those need to return 404 codes because those things are not found. So that's why we create the sort of not found key. And inside of that, we define the code that we want to display to people. Notice I also have a fallback. The fallback is a generic error. 500 is a good one to essentially put out there when you don't really know what else happened. So 500 is a very generic error code. It just means server error, essentially. And you see here on line 15, I'm exporting a function. It expects an error object, and then it looks up the error message that we will pass into the error. And if it matches one of these keys, then it returns that particular error. Otherwise, it'll return the fallback, which gives back the 500 error code. So that is in the config errors file. So you'll see that here. And how do we utilize it? Well, it's actually already implemented. And I can just walk you through it. Here on line 17, we are trying to serve the static file that the person requested. So we're passing in the file path, the extension, and so forth. And as you know, the try-catch block, if any issues happen within this code, then the error gets thrown out here. Now we want to output the error into the console uninhibited. We don't want to mess around with it just in case. So we are using console error. And then we're grabbing the error data using our config errors file with that function in it. So in case of an error, we will serve this static file, which is error.html. You'll notice that in our public folder, we have indeed this error.html, and the contents of it is essentially just h1 with the words, the horror in it. So that is what we should return, and the status code of the request should also reflect this. So that should be, status code should be a 404, for instance, in case of not found. So yeah, this is pretty straightforward. I'll just demonstrate it real quick by starting up the server. npm run starts it up. And if I go to, of course, our normal website, I see the index.html page as we programmed in last time. And if I type in a fake address, blah, 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 I will get the horror. And you notice that in the console, the error is output as is. So it says not found. Yeah, that's everything seems to be working on. So that's essentially error handling. If you want me to go into this any more in depth, I would love to. And we're actually going to look at this a little bit further later on when we're dealing with the next stream, because we're going to be dealing with form validation and things like that. So we'll need to enhance this a little bit in time. But at the moment, this suffices for our static file server and for our routes. So we'll just move along. So let's hit up templating. What is templating? Well, it's essentially the view of our application and all of the logic that makes it work. So when you load up, Facebook.com, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens on Facebook.com. It loads in your activity feed, it authenticates you, it does all this other stuff. And there's a certain separation between the business logic, aka the fetching of all that data from the database, and the returning of all that data, and of course the actual HTML, or in Facebook's case, React, that makes all of that visually what you perceive. The other part that we're going to be utilizing is reusable pieces. We're going to be using partials a lot. on every page, in fact, there will be partials. This will make life a lot simpler for us because we won't have to recode repetitive things like the HTML header of the page and the footer. So we're going to be reusing those pieces time and time again. And then the last part is dynamic content. So there are going to be times when you need to display certain content based on whether or not a person is logged in or not, whether they are, a pro user or a free user, whether they have made comments in your threads or so forth, whatever it is that your product is doing, you want to display appropriate information to it. So that's what dynamic content is, and we need to support it because otherwise you don't really have a product. You can't really respond to user requests without it. And what we're going to be using is handlebars, handlebars.js. Feel free to read up more on by going to handlebarsjs.com. There's some split-in documentation there. Handlebars is actually a derivative of another templating language called Mustache. And Mustache syntax is, I posted an example there in the notes or in the slides. That's essentially what Mustache looks like, aka handlebars. It uses the double curly brace, and you can use some simple logical operators like if and else and so forth. There's also a way to do loops, and it's one of the more popular packages on NPM. At the moment, there's 7 million weekly downloads for handlebars. So there's a lot of people using it. There's a lot of optimization and bugs being fixed, and it's actually quite a nice library. There's tons of alternatives out there, so if you're following along and you hate handlebars or you don't want to look at it or you don't want to use it, feel free to swap it out for Liquid or Hogan or Pug or Hamel or whatever it is you prefer, and then just adjust your code accordingly. It's really just based on your preference. This is the nice part about using your own code instead of a framework is it doesn't really matter what you use. For example, handlebars doesn't necessarily work very well with React because React uses JSX and components. Well, handlebars isn't necessarily using components, and handlebars is, well, uses different syntax. It's not JSX. So something to keep in mind. It looks like HTML for the most part, and that's another plus for me. The output of handlebars.js is HTML, and personally, I prefer my output to look similar to my input, and that's why I'm a big believer in things like handlebars.js because, well, essentially, I don't want to deviate too far away because a lot of things are lost in that abstraction, and that's one of the reasons I'm making this course because I'm doing away with abstractions, or at least you write your own abstractions. And it supports partials and helpers, so that's a big plus for me. Most templating languages available in Node.js or Ruby or Python or any of the other giants out there, like PHP, for example, support partials and helpers, so you're not going to have to worry about that too much. But that is a requirement for this course. So let's get started, and we will go ahead and install handlebars. Installs pretty quick, and while we're doing that, let's go to the next page, and we'll talk about glob. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later when we're actually using glob, but for the moment, we are going to need to install glob. Glob is essentially used for reading the contents of a directory, but we'll get to that in a few minutes, so I'm just going to go ahead and install it. You can, by the way, read the docs for it. It's written by a guy named Isaac. Isaac, I can't remember his last name at the moment, but this dude actually used to be the CEO of NPM. He created NPM. So this package comes from quite the pedigree. But it essentially duplicates functionality that already existed before it. It uses pattern matching to figure out a directory structure. So yeah, we'll get to that a bit later. And the next thing we want to do is we want to make a couple of folders. There's a routes folder and a templates folder. So the routes folder will contain our business logic for every view, so to speak, and the templates folder is going to have the handlebars markup / HTML markup for all of the things that we actually present to the user. So let's go ahead and do that. routes and templates. And now that we have those two folders, we can start really simply with the base template. Now, what am I saying when I'm talking about a base template? We're going to create a template.hps file in the templates folder and paste this in. Now, you'll notice that this is actually almost the same as our index.html. If you look at the index.html, it's almost identical to this. The major differences are that instead of content in here, instead of that little line that shows the favicon and the h1, we instead include a partial content. So this partial will take care of rendering whatever's inside of the body tag for us. But this right here is, for the moment, going to make sure that every route that we have is uniformly styled, has a correctly formatted head, and is inside of essentially our theme. And the last part is essentially we have this app name handlebar here, and I'll get around to this later. This will have to do with the context of this this template. But anyways, I'll get around to that in a minute. So the next thing we need to do is we need to also create our first view. So for that, we're going to call our first view root.hps. So that's root.hps. And root is, well, nice and simple. It just means the one that is without any, if you don't enter any file path, this is what will open. So this is essentially going to be our home page. And as you see here, I've just basically taken the content from my index.html and I've pasted it right into here. But of course, there's a few steps that we need to do before this is all wired in correctly into our app. But yeah, the point is to render this stuff inside of the content of the template.hps file. You're probably familiar with this stuff already because this is a pretty common use case for templates. So you should probably be somewhat familiar with it, I hope. And now we need to write some business logic. Let's start by actually creating, inside of the routes folder, we'll create a root.js file. And root, root.js, will contain simply this. We are saying that the URI will be / aka that's the homepage of our app. And we wanted to use the template called root. And this will correspond to the root.hps file in our templates folder. So here we are. We are essentially just telling our app how to serve this view. And the next step is, this is a little bit more complicated of a piece of code. This will be index.js in the routes folder. Now you might be wondering, why are we calling these files index.js all over the place? Like we have one here, and we'll probably have a few more later on. The reason is that because if you don't have a file called, for example, roots.js in the root of your project, including in roots will include in this index.js file. So this is the default include when you include a folder in Node.js's require system. And so I just pasted this code in, but you probably want to go through and figure out what it does. So actually, let's open up our trusty Node command line here, and let's do some of these things just to make sure that it works. So first, let's include in the glob package, and let's see what this actually outputs. All right, so we will run it, and you see here, this glob functionality grabs the content of a directory based on this pattern. So if you look up the specifications for Node glob, excuse me, you're passing in a file pattern that you're searching for, possibly options, and then a function for dealing with them. Well, we're using the sync approach that just returns the array to us. So yeah, we're saying include in the, grab all the files in the routes folder that have the .js extension, and then we're passing in the option to ignore the file itself that we're currently running from, index.js. We don't want to create any kind of crazy Stack Overflow problems, so let's just not include this file at all. The next thing we're doing, so because we know that this returns an array, as you can see in the console here, it returns an array of all of the files in the roots folder. So if I created another file called test.js, and I run this code again, you will notice that it picks up that test.js file. So that's essentially what we're using Blob for. It's a really simple module. It just saves you some time. Otherwise, you're going to be including the stuff manually, and it's not really that fun. So inside of the reduce functionality, as you can imagine, we're returning an array here, right? So reduce, if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you look it up on MDN. But essentially what it does is it takes an array and it morphs it into anything you want. So a lot of people use reduce to count things, or to create another array out of that array, or to create an object. And what we're doing is, as a second parameter here specifies, we're creating an object. And passing into it, of course, will be the actual contents of the array, one by one. So in this case, the root.js will be passed in. That's the second argument, file name. And the first argument is the object itself, the aggregated object. So file name is we're passing in row after row. So we include in the file, and that will be route, the variable route. And if we have a template that we would like to use, as we do here in our root.js, we're specifying a template. We want to include that to make it available in our app. So here we're using route.body, and route.body is just going to be an argument, a property of the route object, and the contents of it will be the handlebars file that we wrote here. Now you might be asking yourself, in the previous iteration of this course, we went through the whole promises functionality of the FS library. And here we're using the synchronous method instead of the asynchronous method. Well, why is that? Well, I will tell you why. It's because Node.js is not able to still work with asynchronous imports and exports properly. So when this module is loaded in, the routes index.js file, if it's not synchronous, it will return a promise, and then we have to write more handler code in order to wait for it to resolve. And in this case, because the only thing being returned by this module is actually our object, and it will only happen once in our app because at runtime, we don't really mind using the synchronous method to make our own life easier here. This is just cutting a small corner that won't really have much of an impact on our final application in terms of a negative impact. But yes, so we're including the templates file, we're including the root.hps file here. And so the root object will, well, let's test out to see what it ends up looking like. So let's first of all save it as a variable. We'll call it test. And let's run this file. Node, routes, index.js. So here's what we have created as a result of this. We have taken a list of all the files in the routes folder, and we have compiled this nice little list. And you'll notice that URI and template comes from this file, and we've populated in the body contents that we want to show as a result of someone accessing the route, right? So, and we've created a nice object here, and the key for the object, you'll notice, is the method for the request and the URI that they requested. And so when someone requests a GET request of our homepage, we will know that this is what we want to return, right? So that is that. If this is confusing, please let me know. I realize that this is maybe slightly complicated. But moving along. We now need to modify the responder a little bit because as you remember last time, we can open the file up just to refresh your memory. In the responder here, we created this awesome, beautiful function to serve static files, but there's no way in this function to handle our routes. So that's the next thing that we need to do. We need to handle the routes. So to do that, we essentially want to use this serve route function. I'm going to copy and paste this into my project, and then I'll explain it a little bit. All right. So first of all, we're going to be using the read file sync functionality here as well. We want it part of the FS library. So let's make sure that we alter this this include tag a little bit, so that we both have the open that's still working and read file sync. The second thing we need to include is handlebars. So let's make sure that we add that to our list of includes. The next thing we're gonna need to do is these two lines here. So I'm gonna place them here. So you'll notice that we're including in our routes folder, and that means that we're including in the index.js file. That's this file. So the one that we just figured out what it returns, that's this one here. So when this lib.responder is loaded, it will grab this routes file. The second thing that we want to do is we want to grab this special template file. Now, as we know, template.js is our master template. This is the one that everything else gets included into. So we want to make sure that that's lying around, always available to our app. So we load this at the top of the page, and we just load it into what's called base page here, this variable. The next change that we are making is, I'm going to do this now rather than later. We are going to be replacing this export statement. And before, right, it just exported the serve static file function, but now we want to export serve static file and serve route, right? Because serve route is another potential branch in what we want to serve to people. So let's make sure we don't forget that. So here's the functionality for serve route. We pass in a request and a context, and we pass in the response. And then, based on that, we generate the key. So the request in this case is just the request object that comes from the HTTP server and through the HTTP initializer. So we're grabbing the method, and we're grabbing the URL. And then we're looking up the routes file that we just created, index.js. And if that route is not found, we throw our not found error, just like we did if a file isn't found or unavailable for whatever reason. Otherwise, we use handlebars to register a partial called content. And you'll remember that this is the same as the content here on line 37 of template.js. So we're essentially saying register partial, we're telling handlebars that the content partial will be the body, aka the contents of this template file from the templates directory. And the next thing we do is we use this handlebars.compile method to take our base page, aka the actual template, and compile it. Now you might be asking, how are we passing in the actual body of the page that we want into the content partial? Well, on line 42 here, we registered a partial of what content actually means in this particular context. So there's no problem here. We can just include in the base page, and handlebars will do the rest. We'll include the content where it is appropriate. And the last thing we're doing here is we're finalizing our template by passing in the context. Now, context in handlebars is it's quite a simple concept, but it's we are passing in essentially the key values of things that are important in our template. And that is the end of the response. So we are exporting this function, and I hope it's pretty clear. I realize maybe it's easier for me to read it because I wrote it. I'd love to also hear back from you if this all makes sense to you. But in the end, anyways, we'll maybe move along at the moment. So serve routes will serve our routes object that we created in the index folder, respecting our partials and our main templates and including in a context. That's essentially what it does. But now that instead of just exporting serve static file, we're also exporting serve route, we need to make a small adjustment elsewhere as well. I hope you can guess where it is. It's in the HTTP initializer. Ha ha, ha 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 ha. So let's go into the HTTP initializer. And you'll notice here we are importing the responder module as just serve static file. Well, we no longer want to do that. We want to also import serve route. So we'll do that here. And the next thing we want to do is modify the response function in here. So you see, it's actually quite a simple function. It splits up the URL, figures out if there's an extension, figures out if this is the root, and so forth, serves an HTML. Well, we don't really need that stuff anymore. We need to replace this a little bit. And we also need a way to detect whether this is a static file or if this is the route in question that we want to pull. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that, of course, it's more complicated than that, than what I'm going to present to you. But at the most basic level, essentially, if there's an extension, we're going to serve a static file. Otherwise, we're not. We're going to serve a route. We're going to look for a route. So that's how I'm going to approach this for the time being. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste some of this code, and I will walk you through it a little bit. So we still have this URL tokens. We are still going to try to determine the extension using the same method. We're just going to now figure out if the response should be a static file or a route based on whether there's an extension. And we are going to initialize this response params object. And I'll get to that in a second. But let's go ahead and make some changes. The other change I want you to note here is we're using the request URL object instead of just URL. So let's make sure that instead of importing just the URL portion of the request, we import the whole request. Because we're going to be using it in multiple places in multiple ways. So let's make sure we import the whole object, not just the URL. We also have to make a few changes here and there because, of course, yeah, it's used in a few spots, so we'll have to make a few changes as we go. But the extension variable doesn't change. It's still the same. So we grab the URL tokens, and if there's one dot in the path, then we know that there's an extension potentially, and we figure out what the extension is. This line 9 here, serve response, we're going to replace this logic here with that. So serve response is going to either have the serve static file function or the serve route function, depending on whether or not an extension is set or not in our requested path. And yeah, like I said, the response params. Now, response params is going to be the context that we pass into the handlebars. So in response params, we can actually put in lots of stuff, lots of very useful, important things. But for the moment, we are just going to put in something very unimportant into it, which is app name. You might remember in the template here, in the title, we have app name in the title. Now, if we just load this, app name won't be set. We need to make sure that the handlebars knows what the app name is. So here's some more logic branching here, depending on whether or not. Sorry about the spaces. Copying from slides makes these spaces, so I'm a little bit anal when it comes to this. I hate extra spaces, so I just had to take a moment to remove them. But yeah, so we're going to have a response params object, and we always know that we want to pass in a path. And in the case of an extension, we want to make sure that the serve static file function will know the extension. Otherwise, we should pass in the whole request because there might be important things in there that are, yeah, we can't just figure out at the moment here. And we need to begin this context here. So we're going to start with just the app name. And the app name comes from process.env. If you remember, it comes from our env file from here. That was last class. So if you need a refresher on that, feel free to look at the previous video. If you go to frameworkless.js.org, the previous video is there. So yeah, go ahead and do that. And the last thing we want to do is we want to return the, instead of just serve static file, we now want to make it available to return the product of this ternary statement instead. That is contained within serve response. So it'll either be static file or route, depending on whether or not there's an extension or not. So that is the code for that. And there's a couple other small changes we need to make. So for instance, in the responder, you might notice that instead of file, we need to use path, because path is what we called it here. Now, I apologize for this. I probably should have caught this ahead of time, but I didn't. Probably should have just called it path from the beginning and made it less confusing. But you know, when you're putting these courses together, these little things sometimes add up. You make a change and you forget, and yeah. So sorry about that. But anyways, so all you have to do is change the path here and path on line 14 to make it and on line 19. So that's the changes we need to make. Now, let's see if all of this works, and I sure hope it does. Okay, it starts without any problems. Okay, we have a not found, but yeah, so the code for the home page seems to be working. Let's test to see if we're actually grabbing the template here or not by including in an extra line here saying, this is the template. Oh, it doesn't look like we're serving that. Maybe I need to restart my app. There we go. This is the template. And the next thing we want to do, of course, is to make sure that our root is being included. So I'm going to go ahead and put another p tag here. This is the root view. And we'll restart our app. There. So everything is working. So the view is being pulled in, and it's being rendered in the base template correctly. So I'm going to remove this garbage here. I don't need it. So this is kind of a confirmation that things are indeed working. And you'll notice that we hit an error here, not found. So let's try to debug that. So we tried to load a route that doesn't exist. Well, we should respond with a 404 error instead. But we are getting an unresolved promise error instead. So let's look this one up. On line 14 of responder.js, we have a problem. Okay. So that's here. That shouldn't be running because we're not serving a static file. So let's find out where this is coming from. So line 32, yes. So this is happening in the actual error catch block. So the serve static file, oh yes, we forgot to change, this is the thing that I was rambling about, so me accidentally naming it URI instead of path. So I think now you'll find that the correct error page is shown. So you'll notice that this is the first attempt that I've had at actually serving a correct error in our app. And you'll notice that the request returns a 404 as we wanted. And that is because of this line 35 business here. Now, when I said that we could actually make these errors more interesting, we can do a lot more with this error code. But for the moment, this is kind of okay. So we're specifying what the error code to respond to this particular problem is. And we'll build on this functionality later on. But at the moment, this does exactly what we want, which is serve an error message. All right, so that kind of concludes routes, templating, and dynamic content. Next week, we're going to be looking at, or next stream, we're going to be looking at forms and user-submitted data. But at the moment, I want to say thanks for watching this video. Thanks for sticking with 2 videos now. I hope you learned something, and I hope it's been really useful. And good work on following along. And you've just basically built a static file server in Node.js with no frameworks that also serves routes. And I think that's actually something to be proud of. I think that's quite an accomplishment. It takes quite a lot of work to figure out this stuff yourself. And you're following along, and well done. So let's move on. So yeah, as I said, next week, next stream, we're working on user-submitted content by adding in forms. So for instance, somebody wants to log into your app. Well, you need to capture that data somehow and process it. Figure out if they're the person that they are. So we're going to be doing that next time. In the meantime, please feel free to join the Telegram channel or the Twitter. Feel free to use Twitter to ping me, and you can DM me or preferably just tweet at me if you have any questions or concerns. As always, the code is available on GitHub. I've released it. There's a branch called Stage 2. You can follow the link right out of this slide. Or alternatively, just go to GitHub and look it up. And also, as always, the lesson's final product is available on part2.remind.ist. So feel free to load that up. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I hope it's been useful. And yeah, I'll see you next time. But yeah, in the meantime, if you have any feedback, I would love your feedback. I would love to know what you think about this so far. Am I moving too fast, too slow? Do you like the presentation so far? All that stuff is really, really beneficial to me in continuing to make quality content. So yeah, I'll see you next time, I hope. Bye.